Such is its power that it wipes away all the hardships that accompany the fulfillment of duty, and renders the hardest labors not only bearable, but agreeable. There was a dearth of such virtue in the 12th century, for too many among men, enslaved by the things of this world, either coveted madly honors and wealth, or lived a life of luxury and self-gratification. All power was centered in a few, and had almost become an instrument of oppression to the wretched and despised masses, and those even who ought by their profession to have been an example to others had not avoided defiling themselves with the prevalent vices. The extinction of charity in diverse places was followed by scourges manifold and daily. Envy, jealousy, hatred were rife, and minds were so divided and hostile that on the slightest pretext neighboring cities waged war amongst themselves, and individuals armed themselves against one another. In this century appeared Saint Francis. Yet with wondrous resolution and simplicity, he undertook to place before the eyes of the aging world, in his words and deeds, the complete model of Christian perfection. And even as at that period, the Blessed Father Dominic Guzman was occupied in defending the integrity of heaven-sent doctrine and in dissipating the perverse errors of heretics by the light of Christian wisdom. So was the grace granted to Saint Francis, whom God was guiding to the execution of great works, of inciting Christians to virtue, and of bringing back to the imitation of Christ those men who had strayed both long and far. It was certainly no mere chance that brought to the ears of the youth these counsels of the gospel. Do not possess gold, nor silver, nor money in your purses, nor scrip for your journey, nor 2 coats, nor shoes, nor a staff. And again, if thou wilt be perfect, go sell what thou hast, and give to the poor, and come, follow me. Considering these words as directed personally to himself, he at once deprives himself of all, changes his clothing, adopts poverty as his associate and companion during the remainder of his life, and resolves to make those great maxims of virtue which he had embraced in a lofty and sublime frame of mind, the fundamental rules of his order. Thenceforth, amidst the effeminacy and over-fastidiousness of the time, he is seen to go about careless and roughly clad, begging his food from door to door, not only enduring what is generally deemed most hard to bear, the senseless ridicule of the crowd, but even to welcome it with a wondrous readiness and pleasure, and this because he had embraced the folly of the cross of Jesus Christ, and because he deemed it the highest wisdom. Having penetrated and understood its awful mysteries, he plainly saw that nowhere else could his glory be better placed. With the love of the cross and ardent charity penetrated the heart of Saint Francis, and urged him to propagate zealously the Christian faith, and to devote himself to that work, though at the risk of his life, and with a certainty of peril. This charity he extended to all men, but the poorest and most repulsive were the special objects of his predilection, so that those seemed to afford him the greatest pleasure whom others are wont to avoid or over proudly to despise. Therefore has he deserved well of that brotherhood established and perfected by Jesus Christ, which has made of all mankind one only family, under the authority of God, the common Father of all. By his numerous virtues, then, and above all by his austerity of life, this irreproachable man endeavored to reproduce in himself the image of Christ Jesus. But the finger of providence was again visible in granting to him a likeness to the divine Redeemer, even in externals. Thus, like Jesus Christ, it so happened that Saint Francis was born in a stable. A little child as he was, his couch was of straw on the ground, and it is also related that at that moment the presence of angelic choirs and melodies wafted through the air completed this resemblance. Again, like Christ and his apostles, Francis united with himself some chosen disciples, whom he sent to traverse the earth as messengers of Christian peace and eternal salvation. Bereft of all, mocked, cast off by his own, he had again this great point in common with Jesus Christ. He would not have a corner wherein he might lay his head. As a last mark of resemblance, he received on his Calvary Mount Alvernus, by a miracle till then unheard of, the sacred stigmata, and was thus, so to speak, crucified. We here recall a fact no less striking as a miracle than considered famous by the voice of hundreds of years. One day, Saint Francis was absorbed in ardent contemplation of the wounds of Jesus Christ, and was seeking to take to himself and drink in their exceeding bitterness, when an angel from heaven appeared before him, from whom some mysterious virtue emanated. At once Saint Francis feels his hands and feet transfixed, as it were, with nails, and his side pierced by a sharp spear. Thenceforth was begotten an immense charity in his soul. On his body he bore the living tokens of the wounds of Jesus Christ. Such miracles, worthy rather of the songs of angels than of the lips of men, show us sufficiently how great was this man, and how worthy that God should choose him to bring back his contemporaries to Christian ways. It was undoubtedly a superhuman voice that bade Saint Francis, when near the church of Saint Damian, "Go thou and uphold my tottering house." Nor is the heavenly vision which presented itself to the gaze of Innocent III less worthy of admiration, wherein it seemed to him that Saint Francis was supporting on his shoulders the falling walls of the Lateran Basilica. The object and meaning of such manifestations are evident. They signify that Saint Francis was to be in those times a steadfast protector and pillar of Christendom, nor in truth did he delay about his task. Those 12 disciples who had been the first to place themselves under his government were like a small seed which by the grace of God and under the fostering care of the sovereign pontiff quickly became an abundant harvest. After having holily instructed them in the school of Christ, he allotted to them for the preaching of the gospel the various parts of Italy and of Europe, and some he sent even as far as Africa. There was no delay. Poor, ignorant, and refined, they mingled with the people in the highways and in the public squares, with no preparation of place or pomp of rhetoric. They set themselves to exhort men to despise earthly things and to think of the time to come. It is marvelous to see the fruits produced by the enterprise of such workers, apparently so inadequate. Crowds gathered round them, eager to hear them. Faults were bitterly bewept, injuries were forgotten, and sentiments of peace were reintroduced by the appeasing of discords. It is impossible to express the enthusiasm with which the multitude flocked to St. Francis. Wherever he went, he was followed by an immense concourse, and in the largest cities as in the smallest towns, it was a common occurrence for men of every state of life to come and beg of him to be admitted to his rule. Such were the reasons for which the saint determined to institute the Brotherhood of the Third Order, which was to admit all ranks, all ages, both sexes, and yet in no way necessitate the rupture of family or social ties. For its rules consist only in obedience to God and His Church, to avoid factions and quarrels, and in no way to defraud our neighbor, to take up arms only for the defense of religion and of one's country, to be moderate in food and in clothing, to shun luxury, and to abstain from the dangerous seductions of dances and plays. It is easy to understand what immense advantages must have flowed from an institution of this kind, as solitary in itself as it was admirably adapted to the times. That it was opportune is sufficiently established by the foundation of so many similar associations which issued from the family of Saint Dominic and from the other religious orders, and by the facts themselves of history. In fact, from the lowest ranks to the highest, there prevailed an enthusiasm and a generous and eager ardor to be affiliated to this Franciscan order. Amongst others, King Louis IX of France and Saint Elizabeth of Hungary sought this honor, and in the course of centuries, several sovereign pontiffs, cardinals, bishops, kings, and princes have not deemed the Franciscan badges derogatory to their dignity. The associates of the Third Order displayed always as much courage as piety in the defense of the Catholic religion, and if their virtues were objects of hatred to the wicked, they never lacked the approbation of the good and the wise, which is the greatest and only desirable honor. More than this, our predecessor Gregory IX publicly praised their faith and courage, nor did he hesitate to shelter them with his authority and to call them, as a mark of honor, soldiers of Christ, new Maccabees, and deservedly so. For the public welfare found a powerful safeguard in that body of men who, guided by the virtues and rules of their founder, applied themselves to revive Christian morality as far as lay in their power and to restore in their power apply themselves to revive Christian morality as far as lay in their power and to restore it to its ancient place of honor in the state. Certain it is that to them and their example it was often due that the rivalries of parties were quenched or softened, arms were torn from the furious hands that grasped them, the causes of litigation and dispute were suppressed, consolation was brought to the poor and the abandoned, and luxury, that gulf of fortunes and its instrument of corruption, was subdued. And thus the mystic peace, incorrupt morality, gentleness of behavior, the legitimate use and preservation of private wealth, civilization and social stability spring as from a root from the Franciscan Third Order, and it is in great measure to Saint Francis that Europe owes their preservation. Italy, however, owes more to Francis than any other nation whatever, which, as it was the principal theater of his virtues, so also most receive his benefits, and indeed, at a time when many were bent on multiplying the sufferings of mankind, he was always offering the right hand of help to the afflicted and the cast down. He, rich in the greatest poverty, never desisted from relieving others' wants, neglectful of his own. In his mouth, his native tongue, newborn, sweetly uttered its infant cries. He expressed the power of charity and of poetry with it in his canticles composed for the common people, and which have proved not unworthy of the admiration of a learned posterity. We owe to the mind of Francis that a certain breath and inspiration nobler than human has stirred up the minds of our countrymen, so that in reproducing his deeds in painting, poetry, and sculpture, emulation has stirred the industry of the greatest artists. Dante even found in Francis matter for his grand and most sweet verse. Cimabue and Giotto drew from his history subjects which they immortalize with the pencil of a Parrhæus. Celebrated architects found in him the motive for their magnificent structures, whether at the tomb of the poor man himself or at the church of Saint Mary of the Angels, the witness of so many and so great miracles. And to these temples, men from all parts are wont to come in throngs, in veneration for the Father of Assisi of the poor, to whom, as he had utterly despoiled himself of all human things, so the gifts of the divine bounty largely and copiously flowed. Hence it is clear that from this one man a host of benefits has flowed into the Christian and civil republic. But since that spirit of his, thoroughly and surpassingly Christian, is wonderfully fitted for all times and places, no one can doubt that the Franciscan institutions would be specially beneficial in this our age, and especially for this reason, that the tone and temper of our times seem for many reasons to be similar to those, for as in the 12th century divine charity had grown cold, so also is it now, nor is the neglect of Christian duty small, whether from ignorance or negligence, and with the same bent and like desires, Many consume their days in hunting for the conveniences of life and greedily following after pleasures.